I just love the fact that those life moments, if you don't get excited about somebody proposing to somebody in your restaurant, you should just get out of the business. All of those things, I'm not sure what other people do for fun, but I get to do that for work.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Hospitality groups come in many forms and are a large part of the culinary landscape these days. What impact do they have on the evolution of the dining scene? And as an operator, how do you ensure each offering in the group holds its own identity? Frank Tucker is the CEO of Pacific Hunter Group. Frank, how are you?
I'm well this morning. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to get you on the show. You're a busy man with a very busy group. How are things at the moment?
You know what? It's actually starting to settle down a little bit. We've just gotten through our last opening, and we're going to take the next 2 months to really focus on the new openings and all the refreshes we've done, and just make sure that we continue to deliver well to the guests.
A lot of people on the show over the last sort of year or two have talked about how challenging the times are as an operator with so many different restaurants. Have you seen the challenges in the different sort of levels of offerings that you have?
Yeah, it's probably been my most interesting time in hospitality. Even the GFC didn't present this many challenges. We see, in the premium dining sector, year-on-year growth. I mean, real, true growth. And it's not that it's not that the higher end earners aren't affected by the economy. They seem to ignore it just a little bit better. Or on the casual side, I think one of the things coming out of COVID is when people learned how to cook at home again, which which I can appreciate, except that I want them to eat at my place more nights a week. But we certainly have seen it. It's been certainly on the casual end a little. The clientele there's a little more discerning, and they're really watching what they're spending.
A few years ago, there were the two groups, and now it's sort of one group. Tell us a little bit about the group and the offerings that you have, because as you mentioned, you do have the very premium end and you do have very casual. But tell us a bit about the group.
Sure. I mean, the genesis goes way back to, when I first got here 11 years ago was called Urban Purveyor Group. And we had 14 restaurants, and, through the acquisition of Fratelli Fresh and then the Rockpool Group, that became what was then known for the longest time pre-COVID as Rockpool Dining Group. And post-COVID, we really set out to try to separate the identity of the two. The premium offering, at the time, we were certainly in the market to sell, and so we wanted to have two identified groups that might appeal to two different market segments for purchase. Coming out of that, now that, I say we're one group because the focus is, 2,300 employees that can move across the businesses and, have aspirations across both areas.
That's amazing. That's a huge group. Tell us a bit about the restaurants that you do have in the stable.
I think we're fortunate. I believe that we own the most iconic brand, Rockpool, and, having three of those, certainly Sydney as the crown jewel in the suite of venues that we own. But, the one in Melbourne is having a renaissance period, and Perth is strong. Spice Temple, led by Andy Evans, who's just, really one of the legends in the business and has been since it's been open. Saki, which is, continued to be a standout for the group. And then, we have some fun ones, the El Camino Cantinas and the Bavarians. And really, without talking about, the two latest new ones. I mean, I go back to Munich Brauhaus, which next year will celebrate 50 years of being in business. It's really built this business.
Tell us about the managing of, these venues with such different sort of offerings. Do you sort of have group buying power, or do they run independently? How do the operations of these venues work?
Yeah, it's interesting that we use group buying power, certainly at the beverage level. Right. And and in the casuals, we're able to buy. We know exactly what we're preparing every day. We're not reprinting menus daily, depending on what's at the fish market or, what we're getting from the butchers and the like. We're at the premium ones. I still let the chefs play in the marketplace. So, they're going out and finding, the small farmer that perhaps only offers mushrooms, but we want those mushrooms in particular.
Yeah.
Certainly from beef, we're targeting certain beef providers, and so we get to play across the group. But certainly from a beverage standpoint, and whether it's flour and the staples, we're able to best utilize our buying power.
You briefly mentioned the challenges within the casual sector. Australia's casual dining sector has really boomed in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's quite extraordinary, and you can eat sort of any cuisine in the world. How do you guys as a group sort of stay in tune with that and your offerings to stay with the pulse of the sort of evolution?
Yeah, I think one of the things is having something that people can readily identify with. I mean, El Camino Cantina, in my mind, was always the first Tex-Mex offering. So not Mexican as people would traditionally understand it, but some of the influences that, I'm certainly from America. And, that was one of the things I got really started in the business working at a Tex-Mex restaurant, and always gravitated towards it, a little more approachable and fun. But our company's built on the Bavarian identity. So the Bavarians that we've had, at one point we had 32 of them, and there was a big call for the big schnitzel and a delicious glass of German beer, which for the longest time we were the only ones who had it. So it's played really well for us.
I want to sort of explore the group in detail in a little while, but I'm interested in sort of your life growing up in food and how you got into the industry and things like that. First of all, take us back to when you were young. Whereabouts did you grow up, and was food important in your family?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm born and raised in Hawaii, and grew up, really jump over the back fence. When mom wanted fish for dinner, we'd jump over the back fence with, Hawaiian sling and a pair of flippers and a mask. And, dinner was what we were able to catch. And I didn't really realize at the time, I thought we were poor. In fact, I'm sure we were, but we were eating as best as anyone else. But food was, I was one of 9 children. And so I used to always say, it was like going to a banquet, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And just because of the fact that both my parents loved to cook, really where I spent the most time with my parents was in the kitchen. So, played such a vital role for what I was doing growing up.
Are there any sort of dishes or feasts that you remember fondly from you growing up?
Yeah, we so the extended family once a year would have a big luau, and there'd be up to 600 people at this, and they'd go over the better part of 3 days. So we'd go from butchering the pig and preparing the emu, the underground pit we were going to cook in, and then and it's not that there were tasks by gender, but certainly the men were certainly doing that, and the women were putting together the lomi lomi salmon and the haupia and all the trimmings. But it was really a collective effort. And then what would happen is we'd cook the pig overnight, and I can tell you there's times I miss the smell of dirt. That it's just such a delicious smell coming out of the ground. It's covered with banana leaves and luau leaves, and just steaming all this wonderful fish and sweet potatoes, and then really the next day it comes out. We put out this wild feast for everyone, and I think what really ties it all together is that, there'd be, there were always musicians in the family. So, earlier in the evening, they'd play music, and the younger kids would get up and dance hula, and or they would sing. And later, the tutus or the grandmas would get up, and they call it the naughty hula. So they'd be a little more risque for words, not certainly dress. And they would do the naughty hula after the young kids went to bed. So, but so they'd be generational. You'd have, from 15, 16-year-old, my youngest sister's dancing to, my grandmother in her 70s and 80s was dancing the hula. So played such a large part of how I saw how I saw food and what it meant for families and sharing.
That's amazing. When tell us about your first steps. When did that happen, that first steps into hospitality, where you thought that was an avenue for you as a potential career?
Yeah, you may laugh at this. I was I joined the U.S. Air Force out of high school, and I'm certainly, well, I won't give my age, but I'm certainly older. But when I joined, the base pay was $410 a month pre-tax, and And so like most people, I went and got a second job. I wanted to save money for a car, and I was able to go and hide and wash dishes. And I did walk back and forth to the base to the local restaurant, and I washed dishes for 6 months. And something happened though. It's there's a curse in this business. I actually enjoyed what I was doing, and I figured out a way to wash dishes in a way that was better timely, and I saved the owner money. And I'll never forget him telling me, I segmented off the dish line, put a different tray for knives, forks, and spoons so I could return them back to service quicker. And I'm 18 years old. I've never worked in a restaurant, but it seemed logical. And I remember him telling me, "Who told you to do that?" And I said, "Well, no one." I said it just was logical. And then somewhere along the way, so I spent 8.5 years in the Air Force. And out of that time, other than when I was moving or in training, I spent 7 years working in restaurants at the same time. And where most of my peer group stayed on in the Air Force, and certainly back then retirement was 20 years, I left after 8.5 years in order to do this full time.
Tell us about that transition where you left the Air Force and moved into hospitality. What were the sort of important venues and people in those early years for you?
Yeah, I'll tell you the one person just before I left the Air Force, there was an advertisement for a bartender's job. I was stationed in Homestead, Florida, and I'm like, how hard can it be? I mean, I've drank in a bar before. How hard can it be to be a bartender? And there was an old school bartender. Now, his name was Cy, and he was probably 75, 80 years old. And I went to the bar, and he's like, you're a little young. I said, no, I've tended bar for years now. Now, mind you, I worked in a restaurant. I never tended bar. And he said, well, we'll see about that. But I do have a very good recall memory. And I'd studied the Boston Bartender's Guide for about 2 weeks. So he's saying, what's in this drink? And I'd tell him, and I didn't miss one. And he's like, that's amazing. I've never met anybody your age that knew these. But so, he said, come in on Friday night. And the first person ordered a gin and tonic. Now, mind you, when I tell you that tonic, there was no T button on the soda gun before. It was Q for quinine. And who the hell ever heard of quinine? And and he looked at me and he said, "Okay, I'm gonna give you one chance. You ever tend bar before?" I go, "Never once." And but what he did was he said, "I'll tell you what you do. You pour beers all night long. I'm gonna try not to hit you." And and it's funny. He really, because I'm telling you, I was woefully inadequate. So I poured beers, washed glasses. But for whatever reason, he took a liking to me. And so over the next few weeks and months, he really showed me this business, and I'll never forget that. I mean, I was eager, and at least he had a laugh of it. But he would tell that joke all the time. He'd say, "Hey, tell him what's in the Grasshopper. Tell him what's in the Godfather. Tell him what's in that." And I tell him, he goes, "Now make it." I said, "There's no chance." So yeah, but I used that. I mean, I'm the silly one. I got out of the Air Force, and I actually opened my own restaurant. And boy, if I knew then what I knew now, I probably wouldn't be here today. But I was woefully inadequate prepared for everything that went along with it. I figured if a chicken costs you $1 and you spend it for, you sell it for two, I'm making all kinds of money. And then I had to learn about insurance and phones and utilities and payroll taxes and all those other things. But I kind of did it backwards. But it's the best thing I've ever done for myself.
What was a real sort of pivotal moment for you? I know you've done all sorts of things around the world, but what was the sort of role which really sort of jettisoned you into the industry on a sort of global scale?
I had I've been fortunate. I've had two, I'll call them pioneers. One was Jeffrey Charterow, who was the owner of what was called China Grill Management. And Jeffrey, I mean, his company motto was "Have fun, make money." And that was the ethos of the whole group. And it appealed to me from the standpoint of he just thought that if you did this right, restaurants were fun. And he was a property developer who hated property development and was miserable, but loved the restaurant business. And I was able to work for Jeffrey for 5 years, and he was gracious with time. And, one of his business partners or contract that we had was with Ian Schrager, and we did the food and beverage at Schrager Hotels when he was really the cutting edge of what I considered to be cool way back when. And I got to sit into meetings and listen. So Jeffrey taught me about, how deals are made and to look at what you're getting rather than what you're missing out on. And the only reason I left Jeffrey was I had an opportunity to work for Steve Wynn in Las Vegas, and I was dumbfounded. I went to for what was supposed to be a 15-minute interview, and 2.5 hours later, I left with a contract in hand to go to work for him.
Wow. Tell us about your role with Wynn Resorts. What was sort of your day to day, and where did it take you?
Yeah, we. I like to say that one of my claims to fame is that I was employee number 81, and there weren't more than 100 of us for really 3 years before we started gearing up to open the resort. So during that time, we did everything. If we were entertaining, and we were entertaining prospective investors and world leaders, and with Steve, these were world leaders, and we do dinners. And so, the head of culinary was cooking, and I'd like to say I was cooking. He was letting me prepare something, and I was certainly serving food and washing dishes. And I was a director in this company. And so, you find out real quickly that small teams of really professional people can work really well. And what Steve would always teach you is to park your ego. And I remembered the president of the company came in once. He goes, why are you washing dishes? I'm like, well, it's either you or me. And he goes, yeah, enjoy washing dishes. And he walked out. And I was like, it was actually funny at the time. I kept thinking, trust me, if there was somebody else, but he hadn't known. I started off as a dishwasher. It's not the worst job I've ever had. So. And then with Steve, I was able to, I was director of nightlife there, and we were building nightclubs and talking about things that we take for granted now. Like, how do you take a pool deck with 1,800 chairs and turn it into a revenue center? And, this was the 2003 or four, and, talking about what we now know as QR code ordering that hadn't existed yet. And we just talking about, in his previous casino, the Bellagio, they used 14 cocktail servers, and they were going to use 12 because Wynn was going to be more efficient than that. And I learned two things. One, to be careful what you say when somebody asks you a question, because Steve asked me, he goes, "What do you think about that?" And I said, "Great, another pool, you won't get a drink." And you could have heard a pin drop because everyone that was part of the old Wynn team, and these were wonderful people, they just had hotel think. And it was important for many things. And he said, "Explain that." I said, "Okay, a cocktail server tray holds 16 drinks. This is the number of servers on times the number of drinks." I said, pick out the 200 and plus chairs, and then tell everyone else good luck getting a drink." And he thought it was innovative, and I think I was uninvited for meetings for about 6 months. And I remember getting a call from his secretary, and Joyce said, "Hold for the boss." And he said, "Hey, Tuck, you still there?" I go, "Yeah." He goes, "You work here?" I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Where you been?" I go, I show up for work every day, 9 to 5, surfing the internet. I learned more about the Roman Empire. I had nothing to do. And I had this beautiful office in the old Desert Inn. And he goes, "Let me guess, the pool meeting." I go, "Pool meeting." And so, we were able to work past that. But, we did innovative things from, he was gracious, but, we had to pick out every piece of cutlery he held himself, every chair he sat in, every linen that went on a table. This was whether it was in the restaurants or in the hotel rooms or the carpet on the casino floor. I mean, that's how he was involved in every single part of the process. And, I was fortunate. For whatever reason, he liked me. And he would say, "If you want to learn," they were programming what's called the Lake of Dreams. And he's like, "If you want to learn, you just have to be here when I'm here." And sometimes it'd be midnight or 1 in the morning. And he said, "We'll see if you're still here." And I'd stick around because I was having a ball.
You've overseen operations across the States and London and Mexico City. Tell us about that. How do you sort of pull that sort of gig off, and what does it take to make sure everything is running smoothly when you're so far away from everything all the time?
Yeah, it'll always come down to people. I mean, I think one of the things is you do have to manage, and you have to understand at the venue level what the challenges are, but you do have to hire people and trust them to do their work. And that I've been fortunate that the people that I work with, I ask for people to be honest, which means you're going to hear things you don't want to sometimes, including that maybe one of my ideas just doesn't work. But I actually welcome that. And so people test that theory, rather than saying, "Oh, Frank, you're so smart." Really, Frank, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of. We'll go out. We did it, and we did it our best. It doesn't work. Would you consider? And it took me some, I did have to mature over the number of years, but I just hire the right people and then tell them, listen, you're accountable for the outcome. And one of the most important things, and this is a Steve Wynn thing, he would say, Tuck, I want an outcome. He goes, I used to say you could only do it my way. He goes, if you deliver the outcome in the time that I want it, I don't care how you get it done.
Yeah.
And that was really freeing for me. So, Steve would say he doesn't want to have 100 Steve Wynns working for him. Which I understood what it meant afterwards. I mean, he liked the brilliance and the genius of it, but he actually wanted people that perhaps approach things differently. And so I was very fortunate to do that as well.
How did the opportunity in Australia sort of happen for you, and what lured you here?
I was on LinkedIn, and I had been considering going back into the. I left the workforce for about 5 years. I'd call it a retirement, but it was a retirement. Took a break from working, and my two older girls were finishing up school and wanted to spend time with them. And I decided to get back into. I was doing consulting, which is that great thing about working more than you ever did, and perhaps not getting paid as much, but you feel like you're your own boss. And I saw an advertisement for a general manager of food and beverage in Australia. I can't tell you that there's a reason other than I said, well, I'd be interested. I sent the recruiter a note. And about 6 weeks later, I had actually forgotten about it. It was December. 6 weeks later, sent me a note, said, hey, this is Alex. I'm the recruiter, and this is what the owner of the company is looking for. That's the title, which I had actually been, general manager in the U.S. is a job, but it's not the level that it was that here. And he said, what do you know about Australia? I'm like, well, be honest with you, I'm not sure I could find it on a map. And he said, we talked for a little while, and I remember like we did what was then a Zoom call or a video call, and interviewed. And he said, listen, we'd like you to come out. And arrived here on a Wednesday, and I was used to people being at the airport with a sign, Frank Tucker, and there was nobody. And so I called and I said, I'm at the airport. They said, yeah, just catch the train to Circular Quay. And I'm like, I'm gonna get on a plane and go back to America. I mean, I'm like, I can't believe no one's here. And then who knew that you spelled, key, Quay? I'm thinking it's Key. I can't even find it. And I took the train, and then I noticed it was genius. You get off at Circular Quay, and you're on the platform, and to the right is the Opera House, and to the left is the Sydney Harbor Bridge, and it was a perfect day in January. And I was like, this is genius. And then, they're like, drag your bags up the street to where it was, because our offices were always above the Argyle. And 2 days, I had signed the contract the next day, and I was back 7 days later to go to work. So I was fascinated by the opportunity to help John, get his company ready for sale. But I fell in love with it. I mean, I remember walking the city, wondering why nobody felt like they were trying to rob me, because being in the U.S. in major cities, that was going to happen. And everyone was friendly. And, George Street, there was no light rail. I was fascinated by the small stores. And the last thing when I flew over Moore, I said, no matter what, don't sign a contract. She goes, you're going to fall in love and then you're going to sign a contract. But I didn't listen to her. So.
What did you think of the hospitality offering in Australia when you sort of first arrived? Were you surprised by it?
Yeah, in some ways, many ways, and then I learned a lot. I'll tell you the one thing that it took me. Anyone coming here now that's not from Australia, I wish I would have spent more time at the local pub, because one thing that you can't do is ever discount how much the local pub means to everyone. The food can be, the food is cheap and cheerful. Maybe the interiors are not as nice, but that's home. For many people, that's where they go back to. And so I think sometimes in the beginning, I didn't understand the attraction to it. Now I understand it as well as anyone. I like the fact that it was not as stuffy in the premium dining area. At the time we had just sake, which was our premium offering. And that very much reminded me of a Nobu or Social House or one of the other places like that, but really well done, but approachable. And then, I was fascinated by the multiculturalism of talent that was here. So you had backpackers that worked at some of the best restaurants in the world that were moving here, and so you had this wonderful built-in, high-performing professional culinary group that you could draw from to run your restaurant. So I was fascinated by that.
The group was sort of moving along really quite nicely, and there came a time to buy the Rockpool Group and sort of change the dynamic of the group and bring in one of the institutions of the culinary landscape in Australia. What was that period of time like? Were there challenges in that and taking on such a sort of renowned offering as well?
Right. I would say we purchased who is the icon of food and beverage. I mean, it's Neil Perry, for God's sake. Here's the beautiful thing. I remember we did the first real leadership meeting when I said I was excited to what was really, I'll say partner with Neil. From a technical standpoint, we bought his business, and everybody one side, there was one side that said we should just say we bought him. I'm like, how about let's just go to business together? He brings this wonderful passion for food. He certainly had we had sake, he had Rockpool, and we were all terribly protective of both sides. The hardest thing was blending the two teams together where it didn't feel like somebody was compromising one side or the next. And I think Neil has said it best. We still stay in contact with one another. Our daughters went to school together, so there used to be this thought that we, the group, and then perhaps even Neil and I didn't get along. I'm like, you understand, our kids are in the same class, right? Like Saturday morning sports, either Sam or Neil are there, and myself and my wife are there. My wife and Sam had worked the canteen together. So, I think people forget outside of this, like we're parents and, we do all kinds of things. But Neil had said it best. I think for him, it was ultimately there was a CEO and we all reported up through Tom, including Neil. Neil has said it best. That's very tough from being your own boss for years and then having to do that. I think one of the things that I'm most grateful for is that, when Neil left the business in 20, probably was a year or two break. We actually didn't, there was a little thing called COVID in between, right? And we were all so busy trying to survive that by the time we came out of it, that we were able to look at one another to say, listen, are we better off being collaborative? Are we better off recognizing the talents of both sides of the group and helping the industry? Or should we just stay in this, what should never happen, which was, either stress or conflict? Because within the group, he is a mentor to so many. And so, it's funny. I think one of the first things I did when I became the CEO was just to say, Neil's our friend. And I eat at his restaurant and restaurants now. He eats at ours. When he and Sam come into the restaurant, it's a wonderful time for us. And I recognize he is the most iconic chef in Australia. Now, you may have Ben or some of these other chefs that want to say, it's not to say there's no one else out there that isn't as notable, but anybody who says different is just not being honest.
What sort of advice would you have for someone out there that's maybe sort of expanding to create a small group or already has a group? How do you sort of maintain consistency and ensure the success of all the venues?
Yeah, I think for us, we should have spent if you're going to combine a group. So I think maybe the easiest thing, you should just buy and one side goes away, right? Inherently, if you ask me, but what happens though, if this is a high performing group that you're buying, then you lose all the insider knowledge and where all the really where all the passion and the secrets and the guest relations are. I think we put that together, the group so I think we bought the business in November of 15 during the height of silly season, and then tried to merge it all together. So, merging two head offices over the busiest time of the year, and then get through the busiest time of the year to the quietest time of the year where everybody goes on vacation. We got back in February. We're like, who are you? And what do you do? And who are you? So I think from a timing standpoint, that if I had to do it again, I'm so happy that Rock Pool Group was available. I probably would have closed on the deal either in June or July, and really had thought out about what areas are redundant, who's the best to lead them, and have a very dispassionate conversation about that, rather than, well, I have to have one, you have to have one, which was sometimes part of the conversation, rather than if Neil's team would have had every single top job, that should have been fine, and vice versa. So it's really important to understand that.
How much have you changed in the time that you've been in Australia now? It's over a decade that you've been here in this role. Has it changed you?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, age and time, it always changes you. I love one. We thought we were going to be here for 4 years. I had a 457 visa at the time. So we're going to do 4 years, and I go back to the U.S. and probably start fishing with my brother in Hawaii again, and just do that for the rest of my life. But we absolutely fell in love with Australia. I mean, our youngest daughter went to school here, and really, she was the one that said, "You might be going back." I mean, we moved here in year 4, and she's like, "You might be going back in 4 years, but I'm not moving schools again. So you better figure out you're going to be here another 5 years." And fortunately for me, like, had she decided to go to university in America, we may have left. I mean, that's my truth telling. I mean, but she identifies more about being an Australian than as an American. And for me, for Leanne and I, my wife, this feels like home to us. Home is Hawaii for us. The beaches are wonderful. What they call a frangipani here is the plumeria in Hawaii. Having gardenia trees along the way. The people, by and large, love Americans here. I mean, the last 2 months, maybe not as much, but that's not my fault. But they really do, because I think when Australians go to America, I know when they used to come before I ever moved here, we loved Aussies. That really free spirit, loud, just fun. So yeah. And so what's happened is I've just embraced that. I don't take myself too serious. One of my favorite things when somebody takes the piss out of somebody. I remember somebody said, "I'm going to take the piss out of you." I'm not. One, I don't know what that means, and two, I'm not sure I'm going to enjoy that. But it's really about, right. Only your closest friends can do that to you, right? And yeah. And then I think along the way is, I I tend to not forget that, I'm even if I do this another 3 to 5 years, right? I'd like to leave a legacy of a company that has allowed people to grow, and they look back and say, I enjoyed working for Frank, and I think I learned something from him, and that our shareholder says that we've provided value to them. Where on the other hand, for me, I don't need any recognition. Maybe younger on, I think everybody, when you're going up the ladder, wanted recognition. The less anybody knows about me, the happier I am now.
Well, we're very glad that you shared some of your story with our listeners today. What do you love about what you do?
You know what? I used to think it was cliches, but no day is like the day before. But and by that, there's different challenges. I like the fact that I have seen people, even here now. I've seen some people that have been on their first date, that have been now married, and now have children, and I've watched them because they're longstanding guests with us. That makes me happy. Some of them are employees as well. A lot of the employees are that. I like to see people celebrate milestones. I actually like when they choose us to celebrate less joyous times. Somebody's passing, but they still come to the restaurant because it was that person's favorite restaurant, or they find that the team understands how to deliver. And maybe not, I don't think we share in their grief, but we certainly want to lessen the burden for them. And I just love the fact that those life moments, if you don't get excited about somebody engaging, proposing to somebody in your restaurant, you should just get out of the business. And whether it's the drink, the ring in the drink, or a special box made by the pastry chef, or somebody doing it over at Munich Brauhaus, in the middle of Oktoberfest and Lederhosen and Dendrils and a big beer and doing that. And I tell you what, because that was their first date. That was the place that they came for their first stein of beer when they turned 18. And so, all of those things, I'm not sure what other people do for fun, but I get to do that for work.
Well, Frank, it's been an absolute joy catching up with you today on Deep in the Weeds. Look forward to seeing where you take everything from here. Please keep in touch and we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it today. Thanks again.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.